So this presentation was put together initially in the 70s when the city wrote its first citywide transportation policy. And in order for the purpose of the public involvement and engagement, we wanted people to have a common understanding about how we got where we are today, why we have the balance of things that we have. So that's what this show is about. And at that point, we were just beginning to have people say, how come we have to accommodate all those cars? And what about this other stuff? And there was kind of like, how about no more freeways? And a bunch of sort of revolutions going on in the community. And so beginning to ground people in how we got here and where we might choose to go was the purpose of the history. So just for orientation, we've got to start with a pretty slide. So this is a view of Portland from Pittock Mansion at dusk. And in some ways what this show is about is why these places, these lines of lights, are where they are, why the arterial system is located where it is, and why there's the local streets in between, and now how it affected the development of the whole city. And in order to think about this, it's helpful to step way back in time and get way high in the air. And when European Americans first came to this place, they came here by ship primarily, or by human or animal power. So and the ship was the way to move the heavy stuff. Someone asked a question or said some things about freight earlier. Almost all the freight was moved here by a ship, and people moved around either with a horse or on foot. And so that affected where they located places. And the reason that Portland here where the Columbia and the Willamette come together was chosen as the location for a city, and why it emerged as the major city in the Pacific Northwest at the beginning is ocean-going vessels could get up to this point and then unload, and there's a river system that gets you into more different places in the Pacific Northwest than anything else. They knew that Puget Sound was a much better harbor than Portland is or than the Columbia River is for ocean-going vessels. But if you look at that map, you can see that there's no rivers leading out of it serving very much. They're all really you can't get anywhere, so you can't get to the agricultural land to take the agricultural products out of the area and get them on the river and get them down to Portland and then send them out to the world. So that's why Portland emerged initially as the primary location. And when we're saying, I'm talking about boats on rivers, this happens to be an early 20th century picture of a boat on the Willamette up near Corvallis. But it's like a panel truck in size. It's a very small thing. So rivers like the Yamhill, which you think of as not being navigable, were for these kind of boats. And because there wasn't any other option, they lived with the fact that they might only be navigable for 4 months out of the year. And because carrying it on a horse or on your back was really tough, they just lived with that. That's the way that they dealt with those limitations of the system. So that there was sort of a general agreement that the confluence of the Willamette and the Columbia is where the major city would emerge, but as far as a specific location, there was a fair amount of competition. Fort Vancouver, there at the top, is actually the original location of the Hudson's Bay Company. It's the oldest community in the area. So it was obviously one of the choices. Both St. John's and Lytton were founded in this 1830s, 1840s period as they wanted to be the place, the primary big city. Portland, Milwaukee, and then a group of cities down near Oregon City and what's now called West Lynn, all were founded with the idea that those would be the major locations. The competition was which location really could handle ocean-going vessels. And if you were an advocate of Milwaukee, you said, yeah, that Ross Island here is not really a problem. You can get around Ross Island all the time. And if you were a St. John's advocate, you could say, well, Swan Island, that's totally impossible. You can't get around that. Ultimately, Portland won out because I guess it was at least partially true that it was the right location. It had good advertising. It also had one of the few places where firm ground actually came down to the water, and we'll see that in a later image. And then the last thing is they built something called the Great Plank Road to the Tualatin Valley. And there's actually a plaque for it here at Jefferson and the South Park blocks. Plank roads are just roads in which you put big planks acrosswise so that it's solid and not mud. Is basically what all you're trying to do is get people up out of the mud. And the Tualatin Valley was the really good farmland, and so they were trying to get the farm products of the Tualatin Valley to Portland, and they had to get over the West Hills. And so Portland investors built that road as a way to get their product to market. That feature topography, I guess, which is what this shows, is one of the things that shapes, obviously, the transportation of the region. Clearly, the two rivers. And the thing to notice, here's Ross Island, and here's that firm ground of what's now the downtown. You all think the Central East Side is firm ground. It was marshland clear back to Grand Avenue until the early 20th century. Obviously, all of Northwest Portland was a combination of lakes and swamps, well, the whole Northwest Industrial Area. So, and then most of the rest of it, there are these bluffs, around Selwood and up in North Portland that made it difficult to get to the water. And the water is what you're trying to get to because it's the easy way to ship things. So this is the right location. The big problem is the Tualatin Mountains. How do you get across them and around them? There aren't very many options. The east side's pretty flat. Some buttes out here, so it would be pretty easy. But it doesn't give you access to the agricultural land over here. The other thing to notice about this is there's this thing which is called Sullivan's Gulch. And what it is, it's the result of an ice dam breaking in Montana at the end of the last ice age, and just too much water coming down the Columbia and spreading out. And so it dug some ditches in different places. And you'll see that gulch. Every time we want to try to introduce a new form of transportation, we stick it in the gulch as a place to test it first. And you'll see this over time. So here's the first really survey map of where the city of Portland is today. It's from 1852. It shows the early settlement. Here's downtown Portland, and you can see there's a grid of blocks. They're oriented to the river because that's what matters. They're not oriented to the compass points. And then there's a series of roads. And so this is 1852. And by 1852, there's a road here, which is essentially where Macadam is today. There's Milwaukee Avenue. There's Powell and Foster. And here's Sandy and Cully. And what's now King Boulevard. And then the Great Plank Road to the west. They're all in place, basically. All the kind of, not the freeways, obviously, but the kind of main roads that are the backbone of the community are already there. And the reason is because they're looking for places that are easy to move on with human power or horsepower. And so what do? The Native Americans have been here for thousands of years, and they've figured out where to walk, where it doesn't, where you don't have to take much effort. So we just follow those roads. We turn those into roads. And in a very quick time, we just follow that. And for those of you who bicycle on Milwaukee Avenue, the odd thing about Milwaukee is it's not straight. What it's really doing is avoiding that Brooklyn Hill. It's the easiest way. It's the flattest way to travel. Most of the other roads are the same thing. They're looking for an easy way to get from A to B with the least amount of effort. Here's a view of downtown Portland. Imagine you're in the Central East Side in the air looking across the river. This would have been in the 1860s. The city is very much oriented to the water. Very small blocks, tiny little 200 by 200 blocks, and pretty narrow streets. And in the upper part there, you can see there's a row of blocks that don't have buildings in them. That's the South Park blocks, what we now think of as the South Park blocks. For them, that was the edge of town. They really thought that and in fact, they platted the west side with big blocks and big lots because farmers were going to be there and city people were going to be on this side. But So when they were thinking of a big city, obviously they didn't have huge ambitions as to what a big city was.
Could I ask a question about that? Did the donors get together and all decide to give 200 by 100?
200 by, for the park?
Or did
No.
they just do it? The first one did it and the rest of them fell in place? Or?
No, actually, well, I'll come back to that. I'll get that when So here's a view of Front Avenue in the 1860s. The wharves are right behind us. So these buildings are, they have industrial activities on the backside, retail and wholesaling activities on the ground floor, shops and offices on the second floor, mixed use, all that good stuff. It's a pretty small town. The other thing to notice is these are not through streets. They're not worrying about getting traffic through here. You know, there's a pile of this and a pile of that, and you just go around it. It doesn't really matter. So that would be town. Here's out in the country. This is a typical farmstead. This one happens to be the Clinton Kelly farmstead, which is at 26th and Powell, where Cleveland High School is today. So you're in the countryside. This is rural. The person who lived here would probably, they farm, and they're coming to Portland maybe once a week, tops, to shop and to buy stuff. So they're not doing a lot of traveling. And when they travel, as I say, they've got a horse, they've got different kinds of wagons for different purposes. They come to town once a week. This isn't actually Portland. This is Hillsborough in the early 20th century, but it's the same thing. All the farmers come into town. They line up. They sell their stuff. They buy stuff. They go back out. So the way you occupy space is different. We think of, for us, there's this kind of diurnal travel pattern. In the morning, we all go someplace, and in the evening, we all go back. They stay on their farms, and once a week, they go someplace, and they come back. Very different pattern.
Were the roads built privately or communally?
A combination of those things, and built is probably a exaggeration. You'll see. I'll show you that in a little bit. You can see this is mostly mud, so it's not well built.
Is that an example of planking?
Of what?
Of the planking that you were...
No, I'll show you now that this is actually a plank sidewalk.
Oh,
Okay. So, but this is the Great Plank Road, actually in the 1890s. So this is the road that made Portland the center of the Pacific Northwest. This is all it took. This is where the Sunset Highway is today. So just the Sunset Highway is on top of this, just for orientation, which is 6 lanes, and it's mostly for local travel. So the scale is enormously changed. You can also see that we did a lot of clear cut. That's the difference. So property lines. This comes back to the dedication question. Federal law allowed people to do something called a Donation Land Claim Act. And you could claim as an individual 160 acres or as a couple 320 acres of land. And all you had to do was kind of mark off the corners, build a house, and live on it for 5 years, and it was yours. And so you have to sort of map all that stuff. This is a map of all those donation land claims in the city of Portland.
was that similar to homesteading?
It is. It's a form of homesteading. A lot of the Homestead Act requirements in other places required you to pay. Here you didn't actually have to pay. If you didn't want to wait 5 years, you could pay a little money. But it is homesteading, yes. And so you can see the early settlers, there's just 2 or 3 of them for downtown Portland. And they oriented their land to the water, just like the people in St. John's and Linton. They did the same thing. After that, the federal government in the early 1850s brought the township and range system, which is, started under President Jefferson, the idea that we would mark off the country in mile squares from one end to the other, and we know how to sell the property. Well, so they come out and they do that to this landscape. They put the main big lines in. And so then everyone says, well, I'm just going to use those lines to figure out where my property is. So everything is oriented to the compass point after that. And what happens is the main line, there's a place up in the Tualatin Hills here called, I forgot.
It'll come to me.
Yeah, it'll come to us in a minute. It's a park. Oh, Willamette Stone Park. And it is the stone that marks the starting point of for the survey in the Pacific Northwest for both Washington and Oregon. And the baseline of it is this line right here. And some of you may know, over your old time, either Multnomah County or Washington County residents, know that there's a road called Baseline Road. And it actually used to be called Baseline Road all the way through. It's now Stark Street. And so what happened is there's these main lines. People make their property lines follow those lines. And so we get these lines that are through. And this is Stark. And here's Broadway. And here's Fremont. Vermont in Southwest. And here's a line, and you can see there's a little jog at here because there was a surveying error. And if you go out Division to 41st, there is a jog in the street because there was a land survey error made in the 1850s, and it's never been worth our trouble to go back and fix it because it's so hard to fix. So one of the lessons of this is, once you've made a decision, particularly about how to subdivide property, you almost never get to remake it. You have to learn to live with it.
So the weird concrete numbered markers on Stark, like near the cemetery, are those?
Mile post, yeah. Heidi?
Maybe this is a goofy question, but why is Burnside our east-west or our north-south marker then instead of Stark?
Because it had a bridge at it.
Okay.
And so it didn't become the marker actually until the 1930s. Ankeny Street used to be the line beforehand. For some of you may live in old houses that have old addresses, and you're trying to figure out, we had a totally different address system. 20 numbers to the block instead of 100. A lot of changes. All right? So here's a view looking, now actually north is to the right on this one, so it's different. Here's downtown. Again, small blocks, grid, turn. Each time somebody decides to subdivide after that, they do the grid. The first two owners of the land, they go ahead and they put their park in. And this guy puts his park in, but because his grid is not at the same angle, they doesn't quite line up. This guy comes along later and sells parts of his property, and the people who inherit it say, we didn't really mean to donate the property. And so that's why there are those 100 by 200 blocks that actually have buildings on them. It was supposed to be a park block, but it wasn't a park block. Now, the thing about all of this is private activity. And there's no, first of all, not until the 1850s is there even a city at all, a government at all. They're just recording these deeds with the county. And they're just following, this guy did it that way, I guess I'll do it that way. There's no set of rules or anything. So there's a tradition about how to build things that applies in a walking, horse-based city that makes sense, and they just keep doing it. So now you get out farther, and over time, as the city grows, people decide, well, I'm going to subdivide part of my property. This is King Boulevard, and this yellow part is the Woodlawn neighborhood, which some of you may know up there around 8th and Deacon for orientation. And because there was actually a steam railroad originally on that alignment, they treated that steam railroad just like downtown Portland was treated with the river. What's important to them? It's the steam railroad. So they oriented their grid to the steam railroad. You get a little farther away from that, and they don't bother to do that. They oriented the grid to the compass points. They keep the small blocks, although they're not all 200 by 200 anymore. They tend to be 200 by something else. But they don't really care if the streets line up, because they're not planning for through traffic. This is not a big, they're just trying to provide access, light, and air to property. That's their goal. So you get a very odd pattern, which means that while the big survey lines gave us Stark Street and those big streets, the subdivisions give us this broken pattern that's particularly common in Southeast and parts of inner Northeast, where they just did it in very small patches. And so here's our local street transportation system. There's no government action here that's decided where the arterials are going to be. It's just completely the result of sort of haphazard actions over time. And sometimes we can't line anything up, so here's a curve. So in this world of it's all water and human and animal power, in 1883 the steam railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, is built, connecting Portland with Chicago. And a few years later, 1887, there's a railroad that finally gets all the way through to San Francisco. And then a little after that, there's another, we need to get one to Chicago via Omaha. And as I say, we're trying to figure out where do you put it? Where's the easy place to put it? Well, here's Sullivan's Gulch. So you stick it in Sullivan's Gulch because now you're not disrupting any of those farms or anything on the side.
Is that the bike trail now?
No, this is I-84 now.
Oh.
This is, you will notice that they had blackberries too. That part hasn't changed. So the steam railroad connects Portland to the world, but within a very few years it also connects Seattle with the world. And it connects eastern Washington over the mountains to Seattle. And so suddenly Seattle, which has the better harbor, is the better place to do your shipping. So whereas in 1900 Seattle is pulling up and we're almost even with us, but we're still ahead, by 1910 it is very clear that Seattle is the bigger city. And has ever since then been the metropolis. So the rail, we started getting rail really as an efficiency measure for moving things around. The first kind of local rail service was in First Avenue along the river. It ran from about Ankeny Street to Jefferson Street. It took 30 minutes to get that far. It was a horse-pulled wagon. So you think the streetcar is slow. This is really slow. The thing about this is, the reason they put the rails in the track here in, a horse pulling a wagon over mud can pull one load. If they're pulling it, if the horse is pulling it on rail, they can carry about 30 times as much weight. So it's a simple efficiency measure for them. And at first, all the rail lines that weren't steam were horse car lines. So you start getting horse car lines. You get, these are, again, this is all private. All the city's only role is to give a franchise. This is in the Central East Side, Morrison Street and Grand. There's a crossing place between a couple of horse car lines. Somebody figures out, you know, if I have a little waiting area, I can sell tobacco and candy and tickets. So this is transit-oriented land use. Early version. And it's because there's no options at this point, really. This is the steam railroad that was in King Boulevard at Portsmouth, in the Portsmouth neighborhood. It had a station. Somebody built that station and subdivided their land, sold off land, actually a member of the Ladd family. And they would give you a free ride on this system on Sunday and take you up into the tower and point out the lot you could buy and sell you, a lot in order to encourage you to live this suburban lifestyle. So this is the suburbs for them, well into the 20th century.
And Homer did the same thing, brought people free on the streetcar to look at their lot in Pearl.
In the Pearl, yeah. So we actually had, partially because it's all private companies, we had lots of different people doing things. There was actually a cable car system that went up into the West Hills and served Union Station. Here's an early electric streetcar. In 1887, the first bridge across the Willamette was built. Before that, it's been ferry boats. There's a bridge built. It's a private bridge. It's a toll bridge. For those of you involved in CRC, listen. There's a toll bridge involved here. And you paid a toll if you walked across the bridge or took your horse across the bridge. Obviously, if you rode the streetcar, you paid a fare the people who owned the streetcar also owned the bridge.
Which bridge was that?
That's the Morrison Bridge, is the oldest one. The bridge we have now is the second Morrison Bridge. And those same people got together and they bought farmland in Sunnyside. This is 30th Avenue. Here's what's now Belmont, Hawthorne, and Stark at the top. So they built the bridge, they put in the streetcar, they bought this land and subdivided the lots. They made their initial money by selling the lots, because there's nobody to ride the thing yet, because no one lives out here. So they sell the lots. People build houses. They have no other way to get in town besides the streetcar. They make their money off the streetcar. So there's a very tight relationship between land use and transportation here. This is the waiting area for that streetcar at 33rd and Belmont. It's a candy shop, real estate office, waiting area.
What family was that?
The Ladd family owned Portsmouth. The streetcars are owned by actually about a half dozen different investor companies initially, and they had 3 or 4 different gauges, that is, track widths, initially. And we never actually had a single gauge. We always had 2 in our. We never got it together to get down to 1 gauge. So this is the beginning of the development of the Sunnyside Business District area. And for 1 year, this was the terminus of the streetcar. And then it was extended over Mount Tabor, and Montevilla became the terminus. Think about a typical house in the time period, a Victorian or early 20th century house. There's an example. You're on a street that basically the only thing that goes by is every great once in a while a horse goes by, but mostly it's pedestrians, so they're quiet. And you want to talk to that pedestrian. You socialize on your front porch. Your backyard is where your laundry and your chickens and your stuff like that is. It's a working area. And the front is your kind of display, social place. And you put your house pretty much as close to the street as so that you can have that conversation with people. It's not like you want a big display place. You want a good working place in your backyard. So here's from 1889. This is what the system looked like at that point. There's the line out Belmont that I mentioned. It's gotten to Montevilla. There's a line out Hawthorne. There's a line that jogs its way through southeast Portland, the Waverly-Woodstock line. And this is Woodstock Boulevard between 41st and 47th, where the Woodstock Business District is today, determined by where the streetcar went. There's another line that wanders through Albina, and it ends up in downtown St. John's. So downtown St. John's begins to emerge and grow and pretty much all of Northwest is then, by that point, is very early it's covered. It has streetcar service. So if you were to look at a map where subdivisions existed, here's Hawthorne and Belmont. You have all your subdivisions out here. See this jog? That's the jog of the line to St. John's. You really can only sell houses if they're near the streetcar, if they're outside of walking distance. A few people try it, but nothing happens.
Just a quick question. So when we're talking about this, people that are settling out in Stark and kind of the front edges, they're making, you were talking earlier, the farmers are taking one trip in for the market or for the goods. These people would be going into the city.
Yeah, these people, the city has gotten too big. They don't want to live all together right down there, and they aren't going to build high rises, so they start spreading out.
And then they're coming into the city for employment and shopping opportunities.
For them, it's as if it's like they are suburbs, the same way you guys talked about, some of you talked about living in suburbs. This is suburban life for these folks. And some people tried different things. Mr. Ladd platted Ladd's Edition. I think probably most of you have been there. Division to Hawthorne, 12th to 20th. Or got lost there if you haven't. There's a lot of different theories about why he did this. It was a very common Victorian thing to do, was to do these very elaborate patterns. I like the idea. The people over here were complaining that they couldn't get from here to there, and they forced him to subdivide. And I think he said, okay, I'll subdivide. But I ain't going to make it easy for you. But We don't really know why. Mr. Ladd died in the early 1890s, and he was the wealthiest man in the Pacific Northwest. He was worth all of $5 million at that point. He owned a lot of what would be called gentleman farms, really. He owned Ladd's Addition, he owned Laurelhurst, he owned Portsmouth, he owned Eastmoreland, and he owned Dunthorpe. So he was very clever in where he picked his locations. But what's kind of important for us is he did not plat all of his streets exactly the same way. He has wider, big diagonals, so he's kind of doing an arterial street system. And again, this is not the city or some planner telling him what to do. This is just him kind of thinking, what makes sense? So he has these bigger streets, and then he has these local streets. This is where you can tell that the slideshow is old. And he does something a little bit unusual. He also does alleys. A lot of the alleys in Portland come from Ladd family subdivisions, not all of them, where there's local streets and you can put the utilities. Because we have those really tiny blocks, those 200 by 200 blocks, it's hard to put an alley in them, so we don't have very many alleys in Portland. So people are subdividing. By 1900, there's about 90-some thousand people living in the city, just to give you a sense of the size of the place. Downtown is where most things are, but you start to get these emergent business districts. This is the intersection of Williams and Russell in inner northeast in the Elliott neighborhood. This is looking the northwest corner, and it was the intersection of some streetcar lines, but it's also the place where people who worked in the railroad yards, and there were lots of people then who worked in the railroad yards, came up the street to catch the streetcar or to come to rooming houses in this area. So there were rooming houses, there were actually department stores, almost a mini downtown. The things that are now at Lloyd Center were in this location. This is now a vacant parking lot, part of Emmanuel Hospital. Just for it's a 1960s urban renewal project. It was all demolished as part of that, except the dome, which is if you go a couple blocks north in Unthank Park, there is a dome, a little pavilion. That funny dome is that dome that you see in this picture. So here's another one. This is another one of these business districts. This is the one on Belmont at 33rd. The building, the waiting area, they've just torn it down. But this gives you an idea about the kind of level of activity and what was going on. This is early 20th century, obviously. A couple things to notice. The streetcar clearly is the dominant object in the space. It gets what it wants. It takes space. But if you look at the actual how the space is allocated, somewhere between a third and a half of it is actually in sidewalk. Because that's what they're trying to serve, is all these businesses along here. And a lot of people are walking around. And there's A-board signs and advertising and people chatting. It's a social space as well as a movement space. So we get a whole network of those kind of streetcars, which stop every 2 blocks. They're very frequent.
How long would it have taken to get from 33rd and Belmont to downtown on a streetcar?
Probably a half hour. Maybe a little longer. I think I one time figured out that in the off-peak period, the time of travel from this Sunnyside to downtown in the 1890s, and today the travel from Sunnyside, Clackamas Town Center, to downtown would be about the same. Because 30 minutes is about as far as people are willing to travel for stuff. So here's this system, and the last thing that they kind of introduce in their way of railways is something called interurbans. And these are, again, they're privately built, but they don't stop every 2 blocks. They stop like every quarter mile or a half mile. And they're trying to actually get you to what we now think of as the suburbs. Gresham is your destination, or Forest Grove, or Hillsborough, or Beaverton, primarily. And so their stations are further apart. And instead of that, in the inner area where we have the 200 by 200 blocks, because everybody is copying downtown Portland, out here, because the stations are a quarter mile to a half mile apart, we get things that are oriented around the stations or in southwest. And so you don't get the same block structure that we have. You don't get the little block structure. You get these communities oriented around stations. This is actually on Multnomah, what's now Multnomah Boulevard in the Multnomah Business District. This is at 35th. That white building still exists. So this is an interurban train, which actually was part of a system, and you could go 26 times a day from Portland to Eugene on this line, and it stopped in Multnomah. So it's a very, it took you, and just as for travel time, it took you all day by that train to get from Portland to Eugene, but you could do it. That network is set up, and then you start getting a different kind of block. So this happens to be in East Portland. The road across the top is Powell Boulevard, as it says. And the blocks, instead of being 200 by 200 with 50 by 100 lots, this one is like over 1,200 feet long and 1,000 feet. And the lots are about 100 by 400 feet inside. So they're a couple of acres. And they're selling them to you, they sometimes call them orchard tracts. The idea is that you could live here, work in the city, but also grow some crops and even have enough land to like have a small orchard and sell crops. It's kind of an early hippie movement. It's a back to the land. The idea was you could get back to the land. Well, that big block structure is what dictates East Portland's layout, and why you don't have the fine grain and interconnected street pattern is because this is the way they laid it out. And just like 41st Division, once you set it, it's hard to unset. Once you set this, it's really hard to come back later and say, well, I think maybe we should put a street in here. So it's, you know, as we think about what we're going to do in the future, we need to think about that. The interurban does something else because it goes way out in the country. It allows you to essentially do recreation by rail. This is at Gladstone. There was a thing called the Chautauqua, which was a kind of a lecture, dance hall kind of place that people would go to relax on Sundays. This is relaxing clothes, circa 1905. But you could also take interurbans on fishing trips up into the Coast Range, and they would drop you off and come back 3 days later and pick you up. So all the things we think of we use a car for, they were using the interurban system to achieve. In the early 20th century, as I mentioned, Seattle starts to be competitive with us. We're a big city, however. We want to demonstrate the fact that we're a metropolis. We decide we're going to have a World's Fair. So we have the Lewis and Clark World's Fair. It's held in northwest Portland at a place called Giles Lake, which is actually kind of a marsh that they dug out and turned into a lake. But they hire, in order to, again, this is a private development. The Oregon Historical Society is sponsoring it, but it's all private money going into this event. They build this temporary event. When the fair is over, they tear it all down. There's a couple buildings in different parts of the city that are left over from here. But they tear it all down, and to help pay for it, they also own some of the West Hills, the part above northwest Portland where there's all those 1920s houses on flat lots, little flat lots. Well, those flat lots weren't there naturally. They had to actually sluice the hill down to get it to have that shape. And the dirt that they sluiced off the hill, they used to fill Giles Lake, and that's the Giles Lake Industrial Area, or the Northwest Industrial Area. That's how they created that land. So they're doing a lot of land changing as they try to look for where else can we be, you know, because they've now filled up all of downtown. They're starting to spread out over the farmland, but they still want to be by the river and the railroads with all this industrial activity. So they're trying to find places to do that. The Olmsteds also, in addition to doing the plan for the Lewis and Clark Exposition here, they did a plan for parks. So this is kind of the first parks plan. It's partially paid for by the city, but it's partially paid for by private individuals. And they laid out what they called the Hillside Parkway, which this part of it was built is now Terwilliger Boulevard. They also basically took the water reservoirs at Mount Tabor and said, well, let's make that into a park and connect it by boulevards. The standard Olmsted formula was parks interconnected by boulevards. They laid out a system. The same year they laid out a system for Seattle and another one for Los Angeles. Actually, Seattle built a lot more of its than we did of ours. Really, the only thing we built at the time was this part. They also proposed acquiring this park down here. Finally, in 1960, we acquired, there's Tryon Creek State Park, but they proposed it in 1904. There's something about that landscape that they thought was really worth saving. So this is definitely a very long-range plan. The other thing that's kind of interesting is the Olmsteds. One of the Olmsted brothers, he wrote back to his wife saying, well, I've been to Los Angeles, I've been to Portland. Really, Portland should be a little more dense like Los Angeles is. So that's not the way we think of it, but that's the way he did.
So did Ladd have anything to do with Tryon Creek being he owned Dunthorpe?
Well, by this time, he's dead. I don't know whether his son did or not. I don't actually know that. I wouldn't be surprised. Makes sense that he would. So here's a view of Terwilliger Boulevard in the early 20th century with a tour bus on it. The only thing that's unchanged is we still have the same light fixtures. So by 1906, the streetcar system is kind of expanded. You can see it here. It's going out Gleason. It's going out to Lentz, out Hawthorne and Foster to Lentz. Pretty much all over here. Big hole here. The reason 1906 is important, it's the year that finally one company buys all the lines. And it's a Philadelphia capitalist who puts them all together and creates a single system. And it becomes what's called the Portland Railway Light and Power Company. They owned all three of those things. And PGE is the remnant of that system.
So did 1906 also make us more competitive, being it wiped out San Francisco?
I don't think it had any significant difference that way. We used the World's Fair as a kind of, in 1905, as an advertising device. It attracted attention to us. This is a map that shows where subdivisions existed, not just where they were platted, but where they actually existed. Again, you can see there's no service into Northeast Portland. There's no development in Northeast Portland. By 1912, lines are being extended all over in a few more places. And by 1912, everything has been subdivided into those areas. Now, by 1912, cars have started to show up. And the streetcar companies are starting to get a little bit cleverer about how they do things. So they don't subdivide the land. If a subdivider comes in and wants to get service to his area, so when the Ladd family subdivided the Eastmoreland area, they subdivide, they want streetcar service. The streetcar company makes them build the extension and pay for the operating costs until it's paying its way. So it's still tight land use and transportation, but it's not quite the same. And again, it's still all private. It's going on. Same thing happened out with Rose City Park out here. The other thing to notice is here's the city limits. They're almost exactly following those subdivisions. And that's where we have sidewalks, is inside that line. And outside that line, the county didn't require people to do sidewalks or build the streets. So we don't have sidewalks and streets. So since we annexed all this, the city annexed all this in the 80s and 90s, we annexed territory that had been developed without sidewalks. And it's hard to figure out how to come back later and get sidewalks. It's usually easier to get them at the time of construction. Back here, question?
Was there much debate at the county level about sidewalk requirements?
As far as I know, no. They never required them. I mean, maybe so some developers occasionally chose to do it, but the idea was if you were urban, you were in the city, and if you weren't, you weren't.
What was the west side extension of sidewalks? The limit?
It's way in here. So here's the current city limit at 65th. It's clear down here. So really just Corbett, Lair Hill, Terwilliger, and just a little bit of the hills beyond
So
that.
not
Multnomah was outside the city until the 1950s.
So if you took Skyline Boulevard as a cutoff, that was not included?
No, Skyline Boulevard would not have been. So this might be a typical shop front. It's about as long as a parked car. You can see there's a shop on the ground floor. There's a mezzanine at 128.5 with a different business there. Same thing here. if you were a hat maker, you would probably be on the 6th floor of one of these buildings. Just because, so we think of those older buildings as office buildings. They were actually sold as or marketed as loft buildings, and almost anything would go in them. And the Christian Science reading room isn't going to pay ground floor rents to have street exposure. They're going to be way up inside those buildings. It's incredibly intensely used, even compared to today.
So the real estate as you went up was low, got lower.
It got cheaper as you went up because even an elevator, it's slower. You don't have the street traffic. You have no ability to catch people. You catch their eye and get them to come in. And the other thing that happened in 1912 is, again, the city and the private sector hired Mr. Bennett, who had helped do the Chicago plan and the post-earthquake San Francisco plan and the Washington, D.C. plan, to do what's called a City Beautiful plan for Portland. And this is a view from Pigot's Castle, the white building. That's if you look down 6th Avenue out here, there's a white house way up on the hill. So it's from that location, looking out over the city. And you can just barely see, here's the current downtown Portland. They're imagining a city of 2 million people between here and 82nd Avenue, essentially. That's and Paris is their image of an ideal city. See, everything is like 6 or 7 floors high, and it's cut off flat. They've created some big boulevards. The park blocks have been made into a big boulevard in this plan. If you look very carefully, there's a big diagonal right through the middle of Northwest, because that's what Paris is built on. And this is their ideal image of what a place should be. This plan was adopted by the voters in 1912, and then they didn't put any money in it, so almost nothing happened. The world began to change also. The car begins more common. This is an early car actually in downtown Forest Grove, and it's on the back of it. The dentist who's pictured here says that he will give you a ride for 5 cents. This is how he helps pay for his car. He'll give you a ride into Portland. And what they would do is they would go just in front of this interurban of the streetcar and pick people up and take them to their destination. Very quickly, that streetcar companies came in and said, "Please, city, would you make that illegal? That's not fair." But it's one way to do cars. Cars do. This is an auto, actually magazine from the early 1920s. The automobile is very seductive, and it's very freeing. And the thing about it is you don't have to have a schedule. All those other things, unless you were walking, or you could afford to own your own horse, which almost no one could. Only doctors and a few people could afford to buy a horse. You're totally dependent on schedules. And with a car, you make the choices. And that's a big difference. So at first, the car is only for very well-to-do people, and it's primarily a recreational device.
I was reading that bicycles were for the very wealthy too. Was this during the same period?
Yeah, a little earlier. Bicycles are a little like in the 1890s, more typically. I don't show anything about bicycles because bicycles didn't affect land use here, elsewhere, and this is about because they weren't around long enough. They didn't have the same impact that transit did. People didn't make choices. I'm going to live here because I have access to bicycles and I'm going to do things in a certain way. We never got to that. There are other parts of the world who couldn't afford cars until much later, where it does affect land use. But here in the United States, and at least in Portland, it doesn't. So this is the Columbia River Highway. It's one of the first highways built in the Northwest. It's about half private money. Multnomah County puts money into it. The city of Portland puts money into it. The Multnomah Falls Lodge Park was a Portland city park until the 1950s because we, the citizens of Portland, paid for that part of it. And the Union Pacific Railroad put money into this road because what they thought was they could sell people in Chicago train tickets to come out here, and then they would rent a car and drive the car, and it would be part of extending the recreation experience. Not for a minute were they thinking this was competing with them at all. This is a supplement to them. So they're more than willing to do this. But over time, people start figuring out, well, you know, this car that I bought for recreation purposes, I can use it for other purposes, and I'm going to use it every day. I don't want to park it in a garage a block away. I want it at my house. So then you take out your front yard and take out a piece of your Victorian basement to create a garage. This is on Southeast 7th, but you'll see these all over town. There's the other thing people did is they would buy a vacant lot. 4 neighbors would buy a vacant lot and go together and build 4 little garages and store them there, their cars there. And that's okay because you don't really drive them all the time. It doesn't need to be like right attached here to your hip. The use of a car is a different thing. So you have a car, you have to, just like now we're talking about, well, we have electric cars, well, how do we charge them up? They had to have gas stations to power them up, and so we get a new land use. When you travel, you don't have to travel. You're traveling by car. Actually having a car in downtown is a bit of a pain anyway. Why stay in the downtown Portland hotel? So we get these auto camps, which start out as tent cities. This is on Terwilliger Boulevard, and they become cabins, and they turn into motels over time. So we start getting other land uses. People start driving. They don't always obey the speed limits. They go above 6 miles an hour. And if you're driving at 12 or 15 miles an hour on a plank road, it's really uncomfortable. So this is the Great Plank Road in 1912 in Hillsborough. They're lifting up the planks. Look how big these old-growth timbers are for the last time, and they're going to pave the streets so that it's a smooth surface. You have to have a smooth surface to have actually either bicycles or cars. Before that, the only reason you paved a street is because there was so much traffic on it that the mud was you couldn't deal with the mud. A normal residential street would be a mud street, and no one would think anything of it. That would just be the way it was. You get lots of cars, and you have to have traffic control. So this is the first form of traffic signal in downtown. This is at 3rd and Alder, I think. And there's a policeman who stands in the middle of the street. There's a pole, and it has flags on it, and 2 of the flags say go on them, and 2 of them say stop, and you stand there and you turn it every 30 seconds or something like that. Well, now, if the speed limit is 12 or 6 or whatever, at that point it is, maybe that's safe. You couldn't get anyone to do that today. We have to figure out a different way. Suburban communities become more attractive. This is Gresham. It's connected by interurban. This is about 1920 or so, and it's actually a postcard. And on the back of the postcard, the farmer who lives near here is writing to his friends in Eastern Oregon. He's saying, you should really sell that farm in Eastern Oregon and buy a farm here, because if you live here, you get the benefits of both the city and the country. So this is the real suburban ideal in my style. So we have cars, and we have to start counting. So this is the first traffic count from 1918. And it's an interesting thing because you can see that clearly downtown is still the primary destination. Everyone is coming downtown. And there's another map that goes with this, which is a map of the streetcars, volumes as well. And it looks almost exactly the same because what happens, you used to ride the streetcar, you buy a car, what do? Well, you're going downtown, you just follow the same road. So at the beginning, they're following the same road. After a while, they figure out, I live here, I can visit my friend who lives up there, and I don't have to go downtown. I don't have to follow that east-west network. And so people want to go on 39th Avenue, which actually at that point doesn't go through. So the city has to start building more and more streets. So they start widening. So here's Southeast 7th before and after. And for those of you who are interested in your history and your neighborhood, the Oregon Historical Study has a collection of almost all of the city took pictures of how many trees they cut down, basically, all over town. And you may find your own neighborhood there. And it's now a good thing to be a wide street. Here's Foster Road. The Bob White Theater is right over here. It's the widest street in the city. Think about Belmont Street again. It's got the same elements in it. It's got the streetcar in the middle, but now it's got a traffic lane as well as parking on each side. If you look really carefully, you can see, though, that it's got 17-foot wide sidewalks on each side, which were required by city code. On any street that was more than 80 feet wide, you had to have 17-foot sidewalks because Paris is their image. And someday, this is going to have 6-story buildings on it, and all the uses are going to be in the same place. I'm embarrassed to say one of my early jobs was to take out those 17-foot sidewalks. We don't have them anymore. We have very narrow streets in downtown. This is Burnside Street before they widened it in the late 1920s and 30s when they built the new bridge. Here they are in the process of widening it. And again, Paris is their ideal image, so all land uses are going to be here, all transportation modes are going to be here. They buy about 25 feet on the north side. They save the facade. They tear out the first 25 feet. They put the facade on rollers, and they roll it back and reattach it to the building behind. So if you go down there and look at north of Burnside, there's all these kind of funny buildings that are really narrow and kind of oddly angled. On the east side of the river, there are those buildings that have their sidewalk is actually underneath an arcade. It's the same thing. They weren't built that way. They were regular buildings. This is how do we get this? We have all this traffic. How do we handle all this? We'll do anything to make this work. So they spent like $3 million to build 3 blocks in the 1930s. And they kind of go, well, this isn't really going to work. This is kind of expensive. We have to think of something else. But they build 39th Avenue, they build the west end of the Ross Island Bridge, all that stuff they start building in the 30s and 40s. They build the Ross Island Bridge to handle cars. Do it. So if you were to look at downtown, this is a view of it. It's still very densely occupied. You have to look really hard to find a surface parking lot, because this is still where everybody comes. Here you can see that widening project on Burnside. It's still the primary destination though. Streetcars are in neighborhoods. This is the Hollywood district. The streetcar can't move. It's stuck on its rails out in the middle of the street. The pedestrians are over here on the curbs. There's all this traffic, and how do you make it safe for people to get out here? So that's one of the reasons people say, well, let's go to buses, because the buses can pull over to the curbs. The company at some point says, I want to go to buses because I'm not getting enough riders to pay the cost of maintaining the rails. And people don't like driving on the tracks. And so there's just this kind of general revulsion over time about how to make this work. We've got all these streets downtown. And they're filled up with traffic, so then we have to build bypasses. This is the 82nd Avenue bypass. This is the band field would be right behind us. Madison High School would be on the hilltop there today. So the state, which is now in the business of building these roads as bypasses, builds 82nd Avenue as a bypass around the congestion of Portland. But we don't lose our land use and transportation relationship. You see there's a shop there. A business person says, well, if there's going to be traffic there, I'm going to try to sell to those people. So then you get shops, and now we have 82nd Avenue that's just lined with shops, and we have to build I-205 as a bypass of the bypass to handle the traffic. The interurbans start being unprofitable, so they take them out. There was one that served Southwest that was on Barber Boulevard. So they take the tracks out, the city buys the right-of-way and creates Barber Boulevard using actually Depression-era monies to build the streets. So we build a lot of streets in that time period, taking over old rail rights away. After they widened Burnside and it cost so much money, they started thinking, well, maybe there's another way to do this. They hire another Eastern expert, Robert Moses. Robert Moses comes out during World War II and does a plan really for how we're going to keep all the soldiers and shipyard workers busy after the war by doing public works projects. So he proposes, or depending on who you believe, borrows from other local planners' plans for a freeway loop that's pretty close to where the freeway loop is today, not exactly. And then he plans an outer loop, which is this pretty close to where 217 is, and this is pretty close to I-205. But you can see the city limits. On this map, the more beige part is the city limits at that point. He's still planning on a city of 2 million people inside that area. the idea that the transportation system is going to change the land use is not in their heads yet. And the other thing you can see is there is no I-205 bridge across the river. He is imagining that none of this development is going to go over there. I'll see the freeway, it stays on our side of the river and comes back around here. He's imagining that all that development is going to stay here. So the idea that this is going to promote sprawl is just not in their heads. They don't have any reason to think that. They've never seen it before. Why would it happen?
So at this point, I believe there was a bridge over the Columbia at this point. But
yes.
There was like nothing or next to nothing outside of Fort Vancouver. Like, what is Vancouver at this point?
Vancouver would have been about 25,000 people, but it's not that oriented to Portland. It's its own agricultural center. Hillsborough is the same way. It's a county seat. Yes, it's a little bit of a suburb, but it's primarily its own business area.
Wasn't it also a lot of shipbuilding, and wasn't Vanport still there?
Yeah, Vanport would be on this side. There was actually equally large housing projects on the Washington side. So the war actually did a lot of disruption for what's going on. But they weren't really thinking that was they thought that was a temporary disruption. They thought once that was over, we would tear that all down and wouldn't go there again.
Was there like a precedent for thinking of highways more as like walls than rivers? It seems like that's the attitude, is that like this is going to enclose things and shape like we think of a greenway doing that now, right?
Yeah, I don't know that it was that far. I'm not sure they thought about it a lot. It's just it's like, why bother? Our job is to build this transportation system. We're going to do it. Moses has a reputation, which he probably deserves. Yeah. So this is his imagination of what those freeways might look like. And again, you can see what he imagined the housing would be like near there. It's kind of Brooklyn, New York, is his image of what was going to happen as a result of building that system. What actually happened, you have a house which is now backwards oriented rather than frontwards oriented because of the traffic in the street. This kind of a land use pattern, you get a much different land use pattern. This one actually has a little patio in front for pedestrians, but it's a very car-oriented development. We get instead of that kind of intensely developed street frontage in a streetcar era, you get individual pads of buildings with parking around them. A very different world, and it was community reaction to that kind of world and the reaction to building the freeways that caused people to want to rethink stuff in the 1970s. So the first freeway they built, where would we go? Of course, we go to the Banfield, the Sullivan's Gulch. So they put it in Sullivan's Gulch. This is getting ready for the grand opening of the Sullivan's Gulch Freeway. You can put it there. You're not disrupting anybody's house. It's not a problem. But it is a land use change. It does provide change access. So this thing opened in 1959, I think it is. It opened in pieces, actually. And Lloyd Center opened in 1960, the world's largest shopping center at the time. And they build a shopping center, and they put surface park. It's got garages, but they also build surface parking all around it, everywhere. And it's a completely different land use pattern than what we had before. It's totally different than the intensely used downtown, where there's these narrow little ribbons of public space and buildings along it. Now there's this massive space used for different things. And this is where the first light rail line was built. And essentially what we've done over the last 20 years is figure out how to put things back in these surface parking lots to make them active places again. Didn't have ditches everywhere, so the freeway in North Portland is the result of buying a block's worth of houses along Minnesota, what was Minnesota Street, and essentially creating a ditch. They dug their own ditch. They built the overcrossings first, and then put the freeway in afterwards down in the bottom. And so in that sense, they're being sensitive, and a little bit thoughtful about how to go about it. But the land use implications are that the people who live over here, who used to shop on Mississippi Avenue, can't do that anymore. And so Mississippi completely goes dead, which I know for you today is impossible to imagine. But in 1970, it was totally pretty much all boarded up. And And so the life goes out of certain districts, and the new life is moved to other places as a result of these big investments. If you come to downtown at that time, this is Morrison Street. We've instituted one-way streets. The car is clearly dominant. This postcard says so. Watch out as a pedestrian where you're going. This is where the light rail is today. So just to give you an idea of change. So this, yeah, you
I just have a quick question. Were they aware of the of demographic implications of building a freeway in North Portland? Was there a lack of consideration because the people were poor and black? I was always wondering about that, and I've never gotten clear.
I think it's probably true. It was the logical historical route as well. In other words, if you go back and look, I mentioned the first, there was a Native American trail that went on that route, and then that's where the railroad went, and then that's where the original streetcars went, Vancouver Avenue, Interstate Avenue, etc. They're all right in that stretch. So that was a logical place to do it. That they got to build a freeway there and they didn't build one on the Mount Hood Freeway corridor probably has something to do with the ability of those communities to resist.
Because it really didn't happen in Irvington, and it really didn't happen in Laurelhurst.
Yeah. And there was a proposal at one time to do a freeway north-south on 39th Avenue through Laurelhurst, and it didn't go anywhere. But part of what happened is after those first few examples were built, there started to be a freeway revolt, which I think you'll talk more about later.
Next week.
Next week. There'll be more about that, so you'll hear about that. That began to happen, bubble up. In downtown, people start worrying because in downtown, for the first time, it's not the only place where all the business is. The business is starting to move out elsewhere, and they're worried about how to maintain downtown's role. And by this point, the freeway revolt has been going on long enough that it's kind of becoming clear that maybe the freeways aren't going to get to build 6 of them leading to downtown Portland, or 8, or whatever they wanted to do. And so, again, the public and the private sector join together to do this downtown plan. They pay for it 50-50. And they start looking and thinking about some of this past history and say, well, maybe we could build a round transit to downtown. And in 1969, the private transit company finally goes belly up, and the city first takes it over, and then TriMet takes it over. So transit is a public facility that you can use for public purposes, you can make public policy decisions about it Before that time, the only role the city had was to say, you can raise your fare or you can't raise your fare. Now, all of a sudden, the public gets to decide where the investment happens. And so when they do the downtown plan, they say, well, let's think about using transit as the spine of service that goes north-south and east-west, and then we'll put the spine of development adjacent to those things. And that's how we'll begin to plan around this. So this is really, yes, there had been some planning before this. This is where planning really begins to get. The transit mall, this is a view of it before the Green Line opened on it, was the idea, okay, we're going to make a very attractive place where people want to ride transit. We're going to put all the service there so it's really easy for people to find where they need to go. And we're going to try to make it not a social service just for low-income people, but something that a lot of people will use. And we're going to try to put the office buildings right close to it and recreate that kind of very urban feel. That's part of what we're doing here. We've got it a little bit. On the waterfront, one of the Moses features was this building of Harbor Drive, a kind of a 4-lane freeway right on the river from north to south. The decision was made to take that out and replace it with Waterfront Park. The idea that we want to come back to our river as a place of importance. So that's part of what this is about.
Steve, when did that happen?
The plan was adopted in 1972. The downtown plan was adopted in 72. By 75, the decision was finalized to take it out and let's go. Pioneer Square is a result of that decision. A lot of things are actually some parking garages, some retail parking garages. You'll hear about parking policy, all kinds of stuff. But a lot of those ideas come from this time period because people are saying, those Victorian neighborhoods, I like them. And I understand, I'm beginning to understand that to have them, I can't have a car, or at least at that point I should say, it's not so much I can't have a car. My neighbor shouldn't have a car. They shouldn't be able to drive through my neighborhood however they want to. The city shouldn't be altering the street system just to serve them and to ignore me as the resident on that street. So I want you to do something about it. And that's the kind of revolution that makes people think differently, that actually results in things like this class. It's like, okay, how do we talk about those things? People start looking at, well, maybe if we have the buses coming back, maybe we can have the streetcar, or what at that point is called light rail. We can have, the idea is, this is the first line, the Banfield line, and it's built around the idea of stations. So it's more like the interurban than it is like the original streetcars. And we get street spaces like this again. So this is Morrison Street. Where the train is sitting there, that's the place where the shot of "be careful in crossing the street" in downtown Portland was taken. So in about 30 years, we go from a situation where it's completely car-oriented, and there's this transformation to, all right, well, now let's look at it different ways. And again, think about this in Southeast Belmont Street. About half the space is actually, there's light rail is dominant, but about half the space is given up to pedestrians. And cars are still allowed in the space. We're not really thinking about bikes yet. But at least it's slow, so that bikes can use the space. And with a transit mall, the federal government paid for it all, basically. With this one, because it's the Reagan era, the federal government says, we're not going to pay for all that nice stuff. You guys are going to pay for that yourself. And the business community says, we will not accept transit without the good stuff, because it's the whole package. It's the street rebuilding, it's the pedestrian improvements, it's the redistribution of space. And so they pay Rick can tell you about the specifics of it, but they work a deal and they pay the local match to get all those other improvements, including the art and the bricks and all that stuff included in the project, because their image of where they want to go is not just of a transportation facility, but of a transportation and land use set of relationships that they want to work with. So that's it. Thank you.
Great. Questions for Steve?